Good afternoon, boa tarde. It's a pleasure to be with you today. On this day, we celebrate the anniversary of the Schumann Declaration, which called for the establishment of the European
Establidade,
Coal
Mr.
and
Klaus
Steel
Regling,
Community.
excelentíssimo Dean da Católica Lisbon School of Economics and of Business and Economics, professor Filipe Santos, caríssimos oradores, minhas senhoras e meus senhores, jovens alunos também que aqui estão, bem-vindos a esta iniciativa organizada pelo Jornal de Negócios em parceria com a Católica para assinalar o Dia da Europa. E seria difícil fazer do tema das crises e do papel da Europa um momento mais atual do que este. Vivemos tempos desafiantes que nos confrontam com a necessidade de reconstruir e reforçar os alicerces do projeto europeu e que nos devem fazer olhar para as instituições europeias, valorizando o seu papel neste esforço de justiça social, coesão e crescimento. Olhemos, por exemplo, para o ISM, uma peça-chave na última grande crise enfrentada por Portugal e que foi também uma peça importante do apoio à reconstrução de uma economia mais forte e menos exposta a choques externos, como foi o caso da economia portuguesa. Hoje estamos aqui para celebrar a Europa, para debater as suas fragilidades e para, em conjunto, debater também o seu futuro. Como o Jornal de Referência Económica, não poderíamos deixar de dizer presente nesta iniciativa e tivemos desde a primeira hora a Católica Lisbon School of Business and Economics também, que nos recebe hoje aqui na sua casa, a querer estar ao nosso lado. Tivemos também desde a primeira hora o interesse e a abertura do Mecanismo Europeu de Estabilidade para participar nesta iniciativa. E por isso, muito obrigada a ambos, Mr. Klaus Regling. It's a pleasure to have you here in Portugal celebrating Europe's Day and discussing with us the future of the European project. E sem mais demoras, porque os protagonistas são os nossos convidados, damos por aberta esta conferência com uma mensagem do Comissário Europeu para a Economia, Paolo Gentiloni, sobre as perspectivas para a economia e as consequências da guerra na Ucrânia para a recuperação económica. Muito obrigada a todos.
Good afternoon, boa tarde. It's a pleasure to be with you today. On this day, we celebrate the anniversary of the Schumann Declaration, which called for the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community, the first step towards today's European Union. Schumann believed that pooling coal and steel production would make war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. And history has proved him right. For over 7 decades, Europe has enjoyed peace and prosperity. Today, that achievement is at risk. We have returned to the European continent with the war just across from EU and NATO borders. Ukraine is under attack for its Western aspiration, for trying to build a liberal democracy based on freedom and the rule of law, and for seeking closer ties to the European Union. And while Russia's invasion is bringing first and foremost incalculable suffering to the Ukrainian people, its effects are being felt across the global economy and particularly in Europe. This new crisis hit us just as our economies were shaking off the effects of the COVID-19 shock and the deep recession of 2020. We started this year with EU GDP back at pre-pandemic levels. Unemployment, also in Portugal, has reached record lows. Accumulated savings were high, and business and consumer surveys showed growing confidence. Of course, as we entered 2022, we were already facing a number of challenges, notably rising energy prices and supply chain disruptions, both contributing to mounting inflations. Nevertheless, the fundamentals of our economy were solid, and our assumption was that these challenges would subside over the course of the year. So our winter economic forecast, which I presented on February the 10th, projected 4% growth in the EU for this year. and Portugal's economy was forecast to expand by 5.5%, well above the EU average. Now, the war in Ukraine has forced us to revise our assumptions. Higher commodity prices for oil and gas, but also wheat, are putting further pressure on already high consumer inflation. Inflation in the euro area reached 7.5% in March, the highest level since the introduction of the single currency. Prices in Portugal have increased more moderately, but at 5.5% they still stand above long-term trends. The war and its consequences, first of all the humanitarian consequences, are also exacerbating difficulties on already strained global supply chains. This is affecting output in a number of sectors, as well as exerting further upward pressure on prices. Explicit embargoes, implicit bans on voluntary withdrawal from trade are inevitably having an impact on commerce. These developments increase both the needs and likelihood that supply chains will undergo major reorganizations. Finally, consumer confidence has dropped markedly since the invasion, while business confidence has so far been less affected. Overall, the economic outlook is once again clouded in uncertainty. The humanitarian and economic cost of the war will depend on its duration. However, it is clear that the war will have a significant economic impact and that our previous forecast will need to be trimmed. For instance, in March, the Bank of Portugal lowered the country's GDP projection for this year by 0.9%. Next week, I will present the Commission's spring economic forecast with our updated projections. In the current geopolitical context, our economic resilience is crucial, not just to protect our citizens, but also our model of Western liberal democracy. That is what is at stake now, and this is why I believe that policy implications are clear. First, we need to maintain agile and responsive fiscal policies, much like we did during the pandemic. The Commission will provide updated guidance for fiscal policy in 2023 as part of the European semester spring package that we will present later this month. Second, we need to accelerate the green transition to reduce our dependence on imports of fossil fuels and ensure energy prices remain affordable. Later this month, we will also present our Repower EU plan to diversify gas supplies, speed up the rollout of renewables, and replace gas in heating and power generation. Finally, we must continue to implement effectively the national recovery and resilience plans member states put in place in the wake of the pandemic. And I know that Portugal is making good progress on its plan. The Commission recently gave a positive assessment to the country's payment request, noting that the first 38 milestones and targets have been met. Continuing in this spirit will be key to supporting confidence and delivering the investments and reforms our economies need now more than ever. If we maintain the same level of ambition, determination, and solidarity that we have shown during the pandemic, I am confident we will overcome also this crisis. Viva a Europa e viva Portugal!
O nosso muito obrigada também à Comissão Europeia por ter participado nesta conferência. We're going to proceed in this conference, and for that I would like to invite you to hear Mr. Klaus Regling, Managing Director of the European Stability Mechanism, in an open lecture about how to make the European economy more resilient and sustainable in the long term, and how to learn, look at the lessons from the past crisis. Mr. Regling, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the stage here is yours.
Now it works. Ah, that sounds better. So again, Viva Europa, to quote the way the Commissioner ended his remarks. It's a pleasure to be here on Europe Day. And Europe Day is always a good occasion to celebrate what Europe has achieved, but more importantly also to look at the lessons we have learned and to look into the future. What is ahead of us and what Europe should do next. And I'm happy to see so many students here, young people, also a few older professors. But you, the young people, you will make the future of Europe. Whatever awaits us, it is you who will help shape this future. Commissioner Gentiloni just spoke about the plan which Robert Schumann launched 72 years ago on the 9th of May. The European coal and steel community was the first step towards what would become the European Union. A union that we all benefit from every day. It was an idea of great vision, creating a European institution to control and manage coal and steel production, resources needed for war, would reduce the chances of conflict between European nations. It has indeed shaped the history of Europe, our role in the world, and allowed for a long period of peace in Europe. In a speech in Washington, Jean Monnet put it very simply. He said, "We are not forming a coalition of states, we are uniting people." This community is turning 70 this year, has grown true to its founding fathers' wishes, expanding and deepening, even creating a common currency for Europe. Of course, it has not been a journey without obstacles. As Jean Monnet also predicted, Europe has been mostly forged in crisis. We have indeed faced our share of crisis in the last years. And with every crisis, we have learned. We made our institutions stronger and more efficient, created new institutions and new tools, and always found ways to overcome our difficulties and differences. So we acted together rather than apart. Monetary integration and the euro have been part of my professional journey for more than 4 decades. And I believe that the euro is an essential element of European integration and of Europe's future, because its role is crucial for strengthening European sovereignty. Only a few years ago, though, some economists and market analysts were predicting the collapse of the euro. This was a consequence of 2 crises that hit Europe. First, we had to deal with the US subprime crisis in 2007, 8, and 9, which entailed a credit crunch and caused great upheaval among banks, also in Europe. Some banks had to be bailed out by governments at great cost. Soon afterwards, the euro area went through the homegrown euro crisis, a sovereign debt and competitiveness crisis, which brought several euro area member states to the brink of bankruptcy. But our monetary union prevailed. We recognized the weaknesses in some member states and in the architecture of the monetary union, gradually corrected them, and created new institutions to improve the prevention and management of crisis. This is also how the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, the institution I lead, and its predecessor, the EFSF, were born. They filled an institutional gap in the monetary union. Until their creation, there was no lender of last resort for countries in the euro area, no institution that could provide emergency financing to a country when markets closed. And this happened to a number of countries during the euro crisis. As you may recall, together the EFSF and the ESM provided a total of nearly 300 billion euro in loans to 5 countries: Ireland, Greece, Spain, Cyprus, and Portugal. These countries reformed their economies and improved their fiscal situation and competitiveness, thereby regaining confidence of investors and ultimately market access. Without the ESM, some countries might have been forced out of the monetary union at that time. And if that had happened, Europe would be a different place today. Instead, over the past decade, significant progress in reducing macroeconomic imbalances has reinforced the stability of the euro area. And after their programs, all these 5 countries had a good economic performance with stronger growth and stronger employment creation than the average of the euro area. Taking Portugal as an example, the government in 2019 had a budget surplus, an overall budget surplus for the first time in 40 years. This was a significant achievement and also a good starting point to face the economic consequences of what would come next, a global pandemic that would spur the most serious economic crisis since World War II. This time, despite the problems that COVID brought, we had some advantages compared to the euro crisis, where we faced a situation that major macroeconomic imbalances had to be corrected in a few countries, while the euro area had also some institutional gaps. All this had changed for the better before the pandemic hit. The COVID debt shock was a symmetric external shock that hit all euro area economies. Fortunately, as I said, we were better prepared than 10 years before. Countries were able to recover and reverse the economic consequences of the extensive lockdowns faster than expected, and were heading for a strong recovery last year until the 24th of February this year. In Portugal, after a budget deficit of 5.8% of GDP in 2020, the government was able to reduce that to half last year. This was better than initially projected by the government, and at the same time, annual growth at 4.9% in 2021 was the highest during the last 30 years. Also, the banking system in most European countries, including in Portugal, is much stronger today. Certainly, banks this time were not part of the problem, as they were during the euro crisis. On average, they entered the pandemic crisis with a much stronger capital base and better profitability, and they have continued to be part of a solution. Finally, we have a much stronger institutional architecture in the monetary union, which we didn't have in 2010, including common European supervision and resolution for systemically important European banks, and, of course, the ESM. When the pandemic reached Europe, EU policymakers were able to react swiftly to help member states. The ESM, together with other European institutions, quickly agreed on measures worth 540 billion euro to lessen the burden for countries, their companies, and their citizens. This complemented the enormous efforts that each country took nationally. The 800 billion next generation EU recovery plan came on top of this and represented another structural development towards deeper European integration. Like the ESM, which raises money in capital markets to finance its loans to countries in need, the European Commission now also sells bonds and bills to finance the recovery fund. These additional funds are channeled through EU programs and are to be repaid over a long period from future EU budgets. Financing from the recovery fund supports reforms and investment, which will ultimately lead to a greener and more digital Europe and strengthen the member states' resilience, competitiveness, and growth potential. This will mostly benefit you, the younger generation in the audience today, because the effects will be felt for a long time to come. All these measures in response to the pandemic were designed to provide more assistance to those countries most affected by the crisis. This solidarity was essential to protect the EU single market and to avoid divergences in the euro area. It also calmed financial markets because markets were positively impressed by the speed, volume, and good coordination of the different European measures. They helped to limit the economic damage of the pandemic and showed an unprecedented degree of solidarity in Europe. Today, we are living in challenging times again. After the havoc caused by the pandemic, we are witnessing a horrifying war at our doorstep. Besides provoking a dreadful human disaster, it is also affecting economic developments everywhere. And Commissioner Gentiloni talked about that. If market projections become a reality, then Europe faces the prospect of having no growth within this year. Fortunately, we should remember that the growth last year, coming out of the pandemic until early this year, was extraordinarily strong. So the growth overhang from last year is substantial. And this means that even if there's no growth within the year, from quarter to quarter, the average GDP in 2022 would still be almost 2% higher than the average of 2021. At the same time, however, and you all know that, we are facing increasing inflation as food and energy prices have risen strongly. That by itself is a huge loss of purchasing power. That means real consumption, which is a vital component of economic growth, will fall this year. Around 2/3 of the euro area's inflation can be attributed to soaring energy and food prices. Higher energy prices also imply a decline in terms of trade, which is the difference between export prices and import prices. Such in terms of trade loss effectively implies a transfer of wealth from energy importers to energy exporters. This loss so far is around 3% of GDP for the euro area on average. This means 3% of our gross domestic product is gone, and that loss is higher than during the first oil crisis in the early 70s. In addition, confidence of consumers and investors is deteriorating, according to the indicators available so far. Many businesses are reassessing their investment plans. But it is not all gloom and doom. There are also some positive factors. Reforms under the recovery and resilience plans, financed under the Commission's Recovery Fund, continue to counteract negative trends. Only a fraction of the funds have been dispersed so far, and there's still a lot of potential. Enforcing the green transformation and strengthening energy diversity was already a key objective for the future and will help Europe to become less dependent on Russian oil and gas. Finally, consumers have a sizable stock of accumulated savings from the past 2 pandemic years. This is not true for every household, but it's the average number for the euro area as a whole. There is this additional savings because people could not spend the money during the pandemic. And this additional stock of savings could be spent as real income drop. Coming back to Portugal, the economy is expected to continue its recovery this year and next year, but at a slower pace than projected before the war in Ukraine. Even though the country has limited direct trade and financial ties with Russia and Ukraine, indirect effects will weigh on growth, mainly through the higher energy and food prices, supply chain disruptions, lower external demand, heightened uncertainty, and declining economic confidence. Portugal's strong position in renewable energy is one positive point, which makes the country less vulnerable than others in the current energy crisis. We need to see how long the war lasts and how it will affect confidence going forward. The increases in energy and food prices will surely affect the poorest most, who spend a large part of their earnings on food and energy. Governments in all European countries have therefore taken measures to cushion the impact of rising prices for the most vulnerable, and that is appropriate if the measures are well targeted. More broadly, the war in Ukraine could accelerate the trend towards a new world order, the trend to deglobalization with potentially long-lasting economic and geopolitical consequences. So what lessons can we learn from past experiences and the current situation, and what more can we do to make our monetary union more resilient in the long term? For me, it is obvious that Europe's voice in the world needs to become clearer, our role needs to become stronger, and we need to move more closely together. To achieve that, the euro area and the European Union will need to ramp up cooperation and strengthen integration further. Last week, the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi called for the EU to embrace, and I quote, pragmatic federalism, one that encompasses all the areas affected by the transformations taking place, from the economy to energy to security, end of quote. I believe a common budget to finance specific European public goods, for example for defense, migration, climate change, would benefit our union. Of course, this would require an EU treaty change, and we know that that takes time, so this is not something for this year or next, but it's good to work on it. I cannot go into all the details of what that would imply this afternoon, otherwise I would speak 2 more hours. But I think it's important to start the debate also on an EU treaty change. Maybe we have time in the discussion later on. Right now, for the remaining minutes, I will focus again on the euro area, on measures needed to make our economic and monetary union more resilient and less vulnerable, and to strengthen the international role of the euro. And I will talk about actions that do not require a change of the EU treaty. Such actions have been on the agenda for some time. The crisis we now face has made the need for these reforms even more evident. The key words here are banking union, capital markets union, and central fiscal capacity for the euro area. In other words, and all these key words would imply that we need more risk sharing within the monetary union. Banking union and a single market for financial services, a capital markets union, all that does not exist today. We don't have a single market for financial services. We don't have an integrated capital market. We have 27 national capital markets in the European Union, unfortunately. If we unite all that, that would contribute to stronger potential growth in Europe. A fully integrated financial market would also dampen cyclical divergences among member states via the markets. And this is what economists call risk sharing. 2 out of the 3 banking union pillars are in place already. A single supervisory mechanism that oversees European banks, and a single resolution mechanism which handles the winding down of the operation of a bank in serious financial trouble. The second pillar, the resolution mechanism, will be further strengthened when the ESM becomes the backstop to the EU bank resolution mechanism, lending money to the SRB if there is a severe banking crisis. But we are missing the third pillar, a common system that can guarantee people's bank deposits at the European level. A common deposit insurance would strengthen the resilience of the European banking sector as it helps to mitigate the risk of fragmentation, particularly in a crisis. Capital Markets Union is the other big project to strengthen risk sharing in our monetary union and makes the euro more attractive to international investors. With Banking Union and Capital Markets Union, risk sharing would become much more substantial in the monetary union. Compared to the United States, economic risk sharing between the member states of the euro area is relatively limited because we do not have a single market for financial services in the EU, nor a common tax and social security system. Therefore, shocks in the US are shared to a much larger degree across regions than in the euro area. The same is, by the way, true inside large euro area economies like France and Germany, where risk sharing is obviously much stronger than in the euro area overall. It is estimated that 80% of local shocks remain unsmoothed in the euro area compared to only 20% in the United States. As a result, and compared to the US, business cycles diverge more in Europe, and fragmentation is a real risk. In the EU, some public risk sharing has happened for decades via the EU budget, lending by the European Investment Bank, and more recently through the support provided by ESM and EFSF in critical moments, and more recently through the Next Generation EU programs from the European Commission. Another way to strengthen public sector risk sharing of the euro area would be a central fiscal capacity for macroeconomic stabilization. In a monetary union, the exchange rate and monetary policy cannot be used to respond to country-specific shocks. There's one common monetary policy, obviously, and also one exchange rate policy. Consequently, fiscal policy is the only macroeconomic policy instrument available to respond to country-specific shocks. A euro area fiscal stabilization function could make additional fiscal resources available to countries hit by a sizable external shock if the national fiscal space turns out to be insufficient. Considering the huge fiscal support during the last 2 years and the energy crisis that countries are now facing, some member states of the euro area may struggle to use their own national fiscal policy to respond to a new shock, considering the high public debt. Next Generation EU was an efficient response to the pandemic. However, it is temporary in nature. It was appropriately designed for all EU countries, and it is not an instrument for macroeconomic stabilization within the euro area. It promotes structural reforms and provides financing irrespective of the position in the business cycle. For euro area members, it is worth analyzing other instruments like a permanent fiscal stabilization function. ESM economists contributed to this debate in a paper that was published last week. In this paper, they propose a revolving fund that could provide loans to member states in tough economic situations. And at the ESM, we could draw on our existing lending capacity. Therefore, no additional taxpayer money would be needed for such a new facility. Let me conclude. We do not know how long the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis that followed will last. The economic consequences are therefore difficult to predict. It seems clear, however, that the war will accelerate a trend towards deglobalization with unfortunate economic consequences. Geopolitically, the world order may be changing. For Europe, the need to integrate more and to make the monetary union more resilient is therefore more important than ever. For me, it is the only way to strengthen European sovereignty and to maintain our role, a peaceful role, in the world. As Robert Schumann said, Europe will not be built all at once, nor according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements. We have come a long way, but we still need some additional steps to deepen the monetary union. They may not all take place at once, but the measures I mentioned are needed. History shows that indeed concrete achievements that Schumann talked about often took place during a crisis. We are now in a crisis, so let us seize the moment. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to our discussion later on the panel. Should I go there or sit down for a moment?
You sit down and then. Thank you very much, Mr. Regling, for your analysis and for the key ideas you left for the following discussion. E passamos então ao tão aguardado também painel de debate, onde iremos falar sobre a recuperação das economias europeia e portuguesa depois da pandemia e sobre os riscos geopolíticos e económicos trazidos pela guerra. Por isso, e para moderar este painel, chamo ao palco a ex-deputada Cecília Meireles. Bem-vinda.
Boa tarde a todos. Queria começar por cumprimentá-los e por agradecer o convite e agradecer também a iniciativa do Jornal de Negócios e da Católica Lisbon. O debate vai ser em inglês, portanto eu vou começar agora a falar em inglês. Be very welcome. I would like to welcome you to this discussion about how to move towards a more resilient and sustainable European community as part of this Europe Day. First, I would like to introduce the speakers for this discussion. First, we will have via Zoom, I believe, Vítor Gaspar. He is Director of Fiscal Affairs at the International Monetary Fund. Very welcome. Then we'll have Cristina Casalinho. She is the President of the Treasury and Public Debt Management Agency, please. And then we'll have Joana Silva. She's Associate Professor here at the Católica Lisbon School of Business and Economics. And of course, Mr. Hegling will be also one of our speakers. I think they can come and join me here on the stage. E eles têm que pôr também, não é? Eles têm de. Eles têm de não? Tá bem. Não. I don't.
Vai ficar ali. Ficamos todos senhores de um lado e senhores do outro.
I'm sorry, I was just checking my watch to count the time. So, very nice to see you all. I think we can start after this wonderful presentation. We have lots of issues we can debate. I think in the last year many things changed. On that we can all agree. We become used to talk, for instance, about pandemic. That was, I remember a time where pandemic was not an issue. It changed everything, not only in economy, but also in life. When we are still recovering from the pandemic, the war against Ukraine again changed the global landscape. Pandemic, debt, disruption, inflation, shock, all this became words of daily use, I believe. And I would like to start with Professor Vítor Gaspar. And I'll start by asking this. Inflation. Today, inflation is a major concern, I believe, for everybody, especially for the common citizen that has to deal with this rise in prices. How do you think we can solve the problem? What do you think is needed to do? Do we need to change the interaction between monetary and fiscal policies? What is the best course of action? Also, I'd like to hear you on global debt. The IMF, and you know this better than anyone, said on December 2021 that global debt had reached a record of $2,026 trillion. This is a record on history. So, how do you think that we should proceed on this? And finally, do you think the rising debt and monetary policies and many stimulus packages in response to COVID may have had a role in the surge of inflation?
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for your kind words of introduction and for your many parts question that I will do my best to answer. But before doing that, I must say how glad I am that I'm back at the Catholic University, more or less at the time of the 40th anniversary of my graduation from the Catholic University. So that's a bit like coming back home, and I hope that my university will not be too disappointed by the quality of my answers. But before going to the answers, I have to pay my tribute to Klaus Regling. I do remember that when I was at the European Commission, I and some colleagues, Marco Butti, Servas de Ruz, and João Nogueira Martins, we edited a book on the euro, the first decade, and we dedicated it exactly to Klaus Regling. Interestingly, I am a reader of the New York Review of Books, and I have been reading the journal for many years. And Klaus Regling is one of the few people ever who has an interview in the New York Review of Books. And that is a transcript of an interview in two parts that he gave in December 17, 2011, and then in January 13 to Al Jazeera, and specifically to Sami Zaidan. And in this remarkable interview, Klaus Regling says the following. He says, markets focus only on one or two things at a time. And they have predominantly a short-run view. Therefore, they do not appreciate the full impact of the decisions that have been taken. He was referring to the summit that had been taken in Europe in December 2011. There is obviously still uncertainty regarding reform efforts in Europe, Klaus continued. But we already have positive results in Ireland, in Portugal, in Spain, and in Italy. So that's what Klaus said to Al Jazeera on December 17. And what makes the interview truly unique is that on January 13, Standard & Poor lowered the credit rating of 9 of the euro area countries, and Klaus Regling came back to comment on these developments on January 26. So it's I believe, a fantastic, a remarkable interview by Klaus Regling, and I do recommend it to all. Now back to the questions you asked, Cecilia, and I want to pay my tribute to my professors at the Catholic University that covered issues like fiscal policy, public debt, inflation, macroeconomic policies, and this included Antonio Pinto Barbosa and Aníbal Cavaco Silva, and my interest on fiscal policy and public debt has been very strongly marked by both. One point, Cecilia, that was clear from your question is that many people argue that inflation helps on public debt to GDP dynamics. And if we look at inflation, surprises, that is certainly the case. A very good example is what is going on in the United States in 2021 and forecast for 2022. Inflation in these 2 years contributes to diminish the public debt to GDP ratio in the United States by more than 12 percentage points of GDP. Now, if you focus, like I suggested, on inflation surprises, the comparison of this debt decomposition with what was expected before the pandemic leads to a contribution of inflation relative to pre-COVID-19 projections of about 8 percentage points of GDP. Now that in turn is one of the determining factors of debt dynamics in the United States. As we see, there is a jump up in the public debt to GDP ratio in the United States of about 25 percentage points of GDP in 2020. But when we compare with the pre-COVID-19 path, the deviation that is now forecast for 2024 is only about 8 percentage points of GDP. That is explained by inflation surprises and also by very strong growth in the United States. But the point, Cecilia, that I want to emphasize is that this is only transitory. That is, the best regime that a country or an economic area may have in order to sustain elevated levels of public debt is a regime of price stability. Just think, nominal bonds offer a stable nominal cash flow to investors. The current value of that future nominal cash flow depends crucially on the stability of the standard of value. So if investors were to expect permanently higher inflation, they would demand persistently higher interest rates, and that would lead to a decline in bond prices right now. The demand for bonds would be less. And therefore, there is a very strong case from the viewpoint of the issuers of a sovereign debt for a regime of price stability. That point is made very strongly by Ricardo Reis, one of the best Portuguese economists, now at the London School of Economics, in the last issue of Finance and Development that was published in March of this year. He basically says that in order to sustain elevated levels of debt, it is crucial to have not only price stability over the medium term, but credible price stability over the medium term. Now, on the issue of monetary fiscal interactions that you raise also in your question, one point that is very important to emphasize in terms of perspective is that both the review of the monetary policy strategy of the Fed that was concluded in the summer of 2020 and the review of the monetary policy strategy of the ECB that took place 1 year later emphasize very much the effective lower bound on nominal interest rates and the downward trend in the neutral real interest rate. And that basically suggests that the monetary transmission mechanism via interest rates may be disturbed much more frequently than was thought, say, at the beginning of the euro area about 20 years ago. And therefore, under those circumstances, it is crucial that fiscal policy supports monetary policy in reestablishing credible price stability and bringing back inflation to target. That was precisely what happened in the spring of 2020 when central banks had to preserve orderly market conditions and fight what was on impact of inflationary shock. At that point in time, fiscal policy was extending lifelines to vulnerable households and firms, but by engaging in unprecedented fiscal support, they also supported monetary policy in its fight against contractionary and deflationary dynamics. And Cecilia, if you allow me, I will stop here and happy to engage further if you think that is opportune.
Yes, thank you very much. Very nice to see you again. And then we will, I'll ask Doutora Cristina Casalinho now. Like we heard, do you think that it's true that inflation helps with debt and with public debt? Or do you think the help is only transitory like we heard? And then how does this change public debt management? What can we expect when it comes to interest rates and higher interest rates? And what can we expect from the European Central Bank in this matter? Oh, sorry.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's not working. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for Catholic and Journal de Negócios for the kind invitation. On the questions you just asked, Cecilia, so I can only agree with what Professor Vitor Gaspar has just mentioned. As just mentioned, in fact, what we see these days is that although we had these assumption in the past that, given the fact that inflation would increase nominal GDP growth, and so when you look at debt to GDP levels, we'd be seeing diminishing levels, and with that, we believe that it would be supportive. Inflation would be supportive of a downward debt trajectory. The fact is that if you don't take so much the aspect that we've just looked at, instead of focusing on the state itself, but if we take, for instance, a firm or a household, these days what we see is that prices are going up because we are experiencing supply chain shocks, and what we see is that firms find difficult to pass on these higher production prices onto the consumer. And at the same time, so you have the energy prices going up, and when you look at the producer prices, you can see that they are actually accelerating at a faster pace than, for instance, consumer prices. So the ability of firms to actually pass on their production costs into the consumer have been contained or limited, so they had to accommodate these increases in prices or in production prices through their margins. So with that, they will be less able to actually accommodate for higher funding costs. If that is true, that is also the case, for instance, for households. They also see their prices going up, but they don't see their wages increasing. So their ability to serve their debt is also contained. So with that, we can say that in a nutshell, the debt affordability, although may not be, even if interest rates don't increase that much, the fact in relative terms, given the fact that the incomes that are generated are reduced, and debt affordability is diminished, and the debt sustainability can be at stake. But what we need to consider is in order to, what is more relevant than anything is, one of the things that nobody likes is uncertainty. So what we really need to privilege is price stability. So that's what we believe that that's the central bank's mission. What they need to do is to cater for price stability, although later that we have seen that these kind of mandate has been more or less coupled with the need to also cater for financial stability. And why I mentioned financial stability here, because it's not so much about being concerned about price stability, but we also need to be mindful of market fragmentation. So when you look at what ECB is doing, you can see, for instance, if you take the words from Elisabeth Schnabel, that is one of a member of the Governing Council, what she's been saying is that, well, it's true that we need to curb the increase in the acceleration in inflation, but at the same time, we also need to make sure that market fragmentation is kept at bay, because and this goes to the concern about uncertainty. So not what firms and households and states need is to have visibility on their costs, and not only in terms of absolute levels, but also in relative levels. So that's why market fragmentation is relevant. When you take, for instance, Portugal, what we need to have is not only some level, degree of certainty of the interest rates that you pay, but you also need to have some visibility on the relative cost, meaning that the spread between Portugal and Spain or Germany is also kept more or less stable in order for these costs, because if you take the previous sovereign debt crisis, what actually has driven the crisis was not so much the overall level of interest rates, because in some cases the interest rate was quite low. The interest rates were quite low in Germany, or relatively low in Germany, but they were relatively high in peripheral countries. So we should not focus only or specifically or strictly on the average yield in Europe, but also need to take in consideration that what's also of paramount relevance is to keep the differences or the risk premium among countries also relatively stable. But that's why I'm saying that the ECB obviously will need to keep increasing, or not increasing, but removing the monetary stimulus.
But chasing less.
But more than that, they will also have to bear in mind that at the same time, they need to make that affordable, in the sense that we don't experience competitive costs increasing very significantly in some parts of Europe, in a way that, given the fact that more indebted countries or more indebted producing industrial sectors will actually be made less competitive relative to other competitors, just because they are facing higher interest rates, and not because the overall increase of the level, but because the creditworthiness of a specific country is actually being deteriorating.
Thank you. And on this narrow road that we can see, it's difficult to navigate between these conflicting problems. I would like to hear from Joana Silva, because we have been talking about the rise of prices and war and the pandemic only on the economic level, but I think we should be talking about the socio-economic level. What do you think the impact of this crisis will be on employment, development, and poverty in Europe, especially in Portugal?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to all panelists and to your colleagues and students. Thank you for all of you. So that phase, this human phase of the pandemic, was already one where we were struggling to recovering levels, recovering in trends. We were already seeing some pre-COVID trends, such as digitization, climate change, accelerating, and we had to cope with that in terms of employment. And we had these issues of monetary and fiscal stability. I'm going to focus on the first two. So in terms of employment, and we made several studies here in our school, what we saw was that there were many jobs at risk. The structure of each economy leads a different risk, and in the top of this you had the risk of automation, digitization. Well, what we see now in 2022 is that most high-income countries, they have recovered pre-pandemic levels of employment rates. But when we look at specific groups, such as youth, we see much more difficulty in recovering. When we see the trend they were already on since the early 2000s, both in terms of employment rates and in terms of wages, we see reasons for concern. And then there is this effects of scarring, because what studies have shown is that a young person who finished their undergrad degree, who enters the labor markets in a worse moment for the economy, in a crisis moment, they enter with about an 8% lower wage, but even 10 years down the road, they still are worse than their colleagues that are exactly the same, but enter in a better year the labor markets. This is what we call scarring effects. This is a reason for concern. And these are long-term trends that were already important, established, and that are very, very concerning when looking ahead. The other aspect is poverty. So the pandemic had exacerbated poverty. In Portugal, we had an increase of about 2 percentage points. And inflation is a tax that is that affects the poorer more than the rich, in the sense that more of their food, of their consumption basket is spent on these essential goods. So they are more vulnerable to this. So we have this context of uncertainty, of crisis, and of high vulnerability, and this comes really on the top of that, and kind of, although, whereas in a war, for example, you see the destruction of infrastructure, buildings, and human life, and it's very clear. In a crisis, in a pandemic, this human development infrastructure is really something that suffers and whose effects are long-lasting. And even if employment recovers the level or even the trend in Portugal, given that the trend pre-pandemic was of low growth, this is not enough to achieve a convergency that is then very important for the stability at fiscal side, at the monetary side, and an Europe that is sustainable and resilient, like we had in the program.
Thank you. And now, before hearing from Mr. Regling, I am sure you want to respond to Professor Gaspar, and also to explain about central fiscal capacity, but I would like to make a challenge to the audience. After we hear from all our speakers, I would like to challenge some of the audience to pose some questions too. I think that would be great to launch the debate here amongst our speakers. Mr. Regling, you talked about central fiscal capacity in the euro area. It has been an issue. How do you think we can achieve that? And you said we could of course use your own borrowing capacity to finance it. Does that have risks? And are the countries of the euro area prepared politically to go ahead with that?
At the moment, not. And this is a long debate. And I very much want to put it in the context of deepening monetary union. It's a proposal that's not coming now because of the war or because of the pandemic. This is really a gap in the institutional architecture of the monetary union that has been discussed by academics and international institutions since the 90s. In the 90s, even before monetary union started, we heard criticism, particularly from Anglo-Saxon economics professors, who said what you are trying to do will not work because you centralize monetary policy and keep fiscal policy decentralized at the national level. And we said, well, it can work if we coordinate well, but then also, in a way, one needs to add an emergency mechanism in case something goes wrong. We did that with the creation of the ESM for a real serious crisis. And as I tried to say in my introductory speech, without the creation of the ESM, probably some countries would have been forced to leave the euro area. So I think it was successful to have the ESM as a lender of last resort for sovereigns. But what we did 8, 9, 10 years ago, that was in the context of a real serious crisis where countries lost market access or were very close to losing market access. And by providing money to them, they could spread the necessary adjustment, which was necessary, because there were macroeconomic imbalances that had accumulated over the first decade of monetary union. With the money from the ESM, the necessary adjustment could be spread over time. So it made the adjustment socially more, one could smoothen it and make it socially more bearable. The adjustment was still needed, but without our money, the adjustment would have to happen overnight. So in that sense, we helped also the social, to cushion the social consequences. Now what we are talking, what's still missing in the architecture is to have a central fiscal capacity, not for these very serious crises, where a lot of adjustment is needed. For that we have the ESM, but something that is less serious. Downturns, asymmetric shocks, particular cyclical developments in 1 or 2 countries compared to the rest of the euro area. And there we don't have a mechanism right now. This is only needed for the euro area, not for the countries of the European Union that are not in the euro area, and there are 8 countries like Sweden, Poland and others. But the euro area countries only have fiscal policy as a macroeconomic policy tools to address a sudden crisis. And that is something that would be helpful, would complement the toolbox inside the monetary union. There are different proposals how to do it. The IMF, and Vito Gaspar is more qualified to talk about that, proposed some time ago a rainy day fund to do that, and that could help, but it has the problem that first you need to find the money to fill such a rainy day fund before the money can be used. In Germany, the former finance minister Olaf Scholz, who's now the chancellor, proposed an insurance fund as a reinsurance for national unemployment systems, which would kick in when there is a specific regional development, asymmetric shock. That would also work. It's a good proposal. And the ESM, we propose to use our lending capacity, which would work in a very similar way. It would be triggered if unemployment numbers go above a certain threshold, which would have to be predefined and would be quite different country by country. And it can be done without first finding the money, and can be done without changing the ESM treaty or the EU treaty. So it's easy to implement if the political will is there. So that's where we are, but I can tell you it's very controversial among our member states.
Yes, I know.
But many things are first controversial among our member states. I remember when Next Generation EU was agreed.
That's what I was about to ask, because Next Generation EU is also very, very, it's innovation.
Right, and when it was first discussed in the summer of 2020, it was very controversial. Yeah. And the summit had to meet within 10 days twice, and they negotiated through the night before there was an agreement in the end. And I remember when the ESM was created, it was also very controversial. And I can tell you I was very unpopular in Germany in the beginning. So that's all part of Europe. But if the design is good, if one can see the benefits later on, and also can see that there's not an excessive burden on some countries to finance other countries, that's also important to find a compromise. Some help is good, but it cannot be that money always flows from certain countries to other countries. Then if one can avoid that, and then one can also find a compromise. And I'm sure we will find a compromise on such a central fiscal capacity. It doesn't have to be the ESM, it's just one possible idea. But to have something like that, I'm sure it will happen.
Thank you. Then I would ask our students and people in the audience.
Cecilia,
Yes,
can
yes.
I react to
Yes.
the other panelists while people are warming up to
Yes, you
ask questions and make
can. You
comments?
can, and you are very welcome to it. So you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So on Klaus and the central fiscal capacity, one aspect that I would like to highlight is the importance of the effective lower bound on interest rates that the ECB highlighted in its review of the monetary policy strategy. And under those circumstances, having the ability to act at the euro area level in case the central bank is constrained and there is an adverse shock is very important for macroeconomic stabilization and stability. So that's a further argument in favor of a central fiscal capacity emphasize less than others, and I think it deserves emphasis. Moreover, one of the proposals that the IMF believes is worth examining is whether this central fiscal capacity could be used as well to provide for European-wide public goods, and those include green policies which are necessary to fight climate change, and the technological transition associated with the ongoing trend towards artificial intelligence and digitalization. Now, moving to Cristina Casalinho, I want very much to amplify the point that she made on the importance of financial stability. That is absolutely crucial, and it's particularly important for the European Union and the euro area. I just want to call the attention to an empirical fact which is likely to play in the near future, which is that when monetary policy interest rates eventually increase to fight inflation, credit spreads tend to widen as well. And that is something which is documented in the IMF flagships that we've just released at the occasion of the spring meetings. Last, on Joanna's and her very important points on inequality in the context of COVID-19 and the recovery to COVID-19, and the crucial aspect of poverty, and in particular, the vulnerabilities of poor people and poor countries to food price increases. But one thing that we learned from the fiscal response to the pandemic is that fiscal policy, the government, has a special role to play when things fall apart. And what happens to the distribution of income and wealth and poverty during those hard times is to a very large extent a matter of political choice. In the context of COVID-19, in a number of countries, the fiscal support mechanisms were so strong that poverty fell quite substantially, and these countries include the United States, the country where I am at the moment, but also Brazil and others. And these facts are also documented in the fiscal monitor that has just been issued. And I stop here, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I give you the word to answer, I would just like to ask perhaps one or two questions from students, because I think it will make our discussion more interesting.
Okay, this is working? Yes.
No.
Yes. No? Yes?
It is,
Okay.
it is.
Okay.
Now it is.
So thank you for your presentation. It's always a pleasure for learning from you. And my question is more related with sustainability. And the question is, what can be the exit strategy that guarantees not only a fast response to crisis, but also a sustainable development paradigm? Thank you.
Thank you. A challenging question indeed. Perhaps another one?
Thank you. So I was wondering what you think of about the relationship between issues of rule of law and increasing the EU's fiscal capacity. Does it make sense to increase the EU's fiscal capacity as countries possibly misuse EU funds with rule of law issues?
Thank you. About the misuse of EU funds, it's that, yes. So, Cristina, would you like to start?
Well, I think that they're not.
They are not exactly, I know.
Sorry. Exactly my expertise field.
But you have the management of the debt, and that has to do with our fiscal capacity, because in Portugal we are always saying, well, should we worry or not about deficit? And deficit, it becomes debt. So
well, I'll try to answer your questions in a kind of different way. When we are these days discussing it, and just to pick up on a comment that Klaus Rolange made about what we need to still to complete the European Monetary Union, and some of the aspects that are still missing or we are still lacking is the completion of banking union and capital markets union. One of the things that at the time that European Commission launched the second version of the capital markets union action plan, one of the under the three pillars, there was the last pillar was devoted to try to remove some bottlenecks that still exist and prevent the existence of a common or a single capital market. And one of the things is that given the fact that most of Europe is an area, an economic union where households and firms are highly indebted and they're almost exclusively reliant on bank credit, we really, in order to increase competitiveness and to make the economy more sustainable and to allow funds to actually be directed for the digital and the green or the climate change transition, you really need to tackle these bottlenecks. One of these pillars was devoted to actually address not so much or to foster not so much tax harmonization, but for instance to just harmonize tax refund. So when we invest in a country, we are subject to withholding tax. But the refund procedures are so complex, so specific to each country, that an investor, when he's investing in a specific country, actually is not able to anticipate clearly in terms of the net return you'll be entitled to. And one of the ideas was just a very simple one, to remove or to harmonize the tax refund proceedings. Another is to harmonize the insolvency law. And given the fact that each country has different company laws, it's difficult to have a similar claims ranking, and it's difficult to anticipate how much the insolvency process will take to be sorted out. So yes. Sometimes we focus overly on this very high level of instruments or mechanisms that we need to address in order to have this European Union working. And we debate about the fiscal, the common fiscal, yes. The central fiscal capacity or space, and we sometimes miss this very small details, the clogs in the
more
system.
earth-to-earth details about what makes the investor invest in other countries. Is that it?
Exactly. For instance, a very pedestrian example. Different countries have enforced contracts in a different way. And for instance, different countries during the COVID crisis actually have different practices in terms of signing of documentation. Some countries, for instance, decided that digital signing was acceptable. In other countries, it wasn't accepted. So, and these very simple things actually can obstacle investment from flowing around this space. And so, yes, fiscal capacity is crucial, is key, in mostly if you take this high level perspective, but sometimes we really need to tackle these cultural traits that we really need to overcome in order to have this common good that we would like to deliver on, that is to be able to deliver on climate change, to alleviate or to relieve poverty, and to tackle supply shocks and demand shocks. But we still need to focus very much on removing these cultural bottlenecks that keep still bogging the system very significantly.
Thank you. A more pragmatic approach to bureaucracy and bottlenecks. Okay, no. Do you want to? I'm sorry, Joanna, but yes. I think it's more interesting to go with the flow. Let's go with the flow.
To add to that, that's why in my presentation I mentioned 3 areas that need to be improved in order to make monetary union more resilient and stronger. Capital markets union, banking union, and fiscal capacity. It's not that one replaces the other. And you're absolutely right. Today, if an investor, let's say in Asia, wants to invest in all 19 countries that belong to the euro area, that poor investor needs 19 tax lawyers, one for each country, 19 people who understand the regulatory and legal system of each country. That's why we don't have a capital markets union. And that makes Europe unattractive compared to investing in the US, for instance, or maybe in China or Japan. And we should change it. It would strengthen our growth potential and also the international role of the euro. That's why this is also, for me, very high on the agenda. The central fiscal capacity deals with another problem. I think we need to deal with all these 3 problems. But the question was on sustainability.
Yes.
And if you give me time, a few remarks on that. Because that sustainability, that's our daily business at the ESM. We try to analyze and understand what's happening in the countries, particularly in the 5 countries that borrowed from the ESM, because most of the money that we extended as loans 8, 9, 10 years ago is still outstanding and has to be repaid over the next few decades. For Portugal, the last installment to repay the entire loan is only in 2040, so another 18 years. And we, as a large creditor, want to understand whether Portugal is able to do it. Our conclusion, don't worry, is that Portugal is able to do it. However, debt sustainability is something that can always deteriorate in every country. Every country is able to mess things up with wrong policies. Also Germany could, or let's say Finland or Austria, AAA-rated countries, if they for a number of years have wrong policies, then their debt sustainability would be at risk. So it's not something that is assured forever. Countries always have to worry about that. And that's why it's right to discuss, as was mentioned, whether certain measures to protect the vulnerable and the poor people are the right ones, whether they are well targeted, or whether they also subsidize the rich people, and then it's a waste of fiscal resources, which are scarce. So this is a very good debate to have. One needs to worry about that. It's an ongoing process that is never over. At the moment, our analysis is clear. All countries of the euro area have at the moment what we call sustainable public finances. But there's a risk that it deteriorates because we have 5 countries that have debt to GDP ratios significantly above the euro area average, which is around 100% of GDP today. And these countries have to be careful, not because they run into payment problems next year, But we know interest rates will go up now from a very low level, so it's a normal development, but we don't know how far it will go. And we know there will be another crisis, even after the war right now, which is a crisis. Let's hope it comes to an end. It will come to an end eventually. But after a few years, there will be another crisis. And it's important for every country to be prepared for that. We never know when the next crisis hits. We didn't know when the pandemic came. That was a complete surprise. The war in Ukraine was a complete surprise. There will be another surprise in 3, 5, or 7, 8 years. And it's important to create fiscal space for that, to be prepared, to be able to act. And therefore, it's very important to have a clear fiscal strategy in every country. This is not a Portuguese problem. It's important for every country. On the one hand, to support the vulnerable, to have the right measures to promote growth and reforms. And luckily, a lot of that happens via the EU program, Next Generation EU, the Recovery Fund. That's very helpful at the moment. But every country needs to look at that strategy very carefully, all the time.
Thank you. Perhaps we can hear from Joanna, because it's true, every country has to be cautious when we are facing good times, to have fiscal space when things are tough, when there are crises. But what is the ideal balance between these two needs?
Now, this is a very important question. I think in this idea of sustainability, of maintaining a certain level of employment or of growth, I think the most one important aspect was exactly what you just said, that we need also strong growth. We need convergence across countries. We need countries to perceive that the benefits and the costs are fair, are not overburdening any country. And we need to understand that if you have a very high debt or if you have high vulnerability, you are more exposed to the risk as a country or as a person. In that respect, I think it's important to also do what we were just saying, use the money wisely, the money that we are spending today, because we'll have to pay it in the future.
Yes.
And this is not just social programs. This means, like Vitor was saying, in the world, different countries had many different effects of the pandemic, for example, in poverty. But they also had very different packages of spending to counter the effects of the pandemic. US had different from Europe.
Yes, very different.
Exactly. So, and these types of reactions require these buffers, these fiscal buffers, require that you have money for in these times to be used, but require another thing, which is that the money is well spent. And this goes to the second question of governance. I think for sustainability, it's very important to trace how funds are spent and what are their outcomes. So it's not just, okay, so I had this packet of money, I spent it all. I had to do 1,000 trainings, 1,000 trainings there were. Now is more, okay, what were the effects of these trainings or of this money in terms of outcomes? How many people found a new job that was better than before? How many were included in the labor market in the jobs that are linked to their training? For the poor as well, you might have countries that have very different coverages of this minimum income or the unemployment insurance mechanisms. And these sometimes are driven by aspects like requirements, national requirements that are too strict or unrealistic. And there are things that are easy to overcome with kind of a broader an analysis of the design of these policies, and doing these designs with evaluation in mind, not just targeting, how much I have to spend, but rather what are my objectives and how can I make these policies sustainable through their effects on improving livelihood, on growth, on final outcomes, not just on spending. That was some.
Yeah, exactly. So that the money is not only spent today, but also it has a return on the coming decades.
Exactly, that the long-term multiplier effects occur in the best possible way.
If I may just
you may just to say this, I think I don't know if we I don't know if we still have time for another very quick round of yes. Go ahead.
There was one more question there.
Very quickly.
Very quick, just to say that these that Joanna has mentioned is something that is already going on, in the sense that when you look at the NGEU, the countries are need to abide by a certain number of rules, and they need to meet a very specific number of milestones and targets and investments. And the level of scrutiny is very thorough. And also these milestones and targets are also set taking in consideration the country-specific recommendations by the committee, by the European Commission. So it's not something that is set, all the funds are deployed or first are disbursed and then are deployed, and this deployment has to do or as to meet these targets, and these targets also
and the checks have to do with the fulfillment.
Bear in mind the imbalances that need to be corrected. One final remark on transparency, and just to go back to Vítor Gaspar, just to stress the effort the IMF is doing in terms of the dissemination of information, for instance, in terms of debt stocks across, namely, emerging countries, and these increasing transparency and making the data available for everyone, more transparent, easy to reach, or also more accountable, making countries more accountable for the information they make available is also a very significant or a very relevant effort in order to allow or to foster that sustainability.
Thank you. Before we go back to Vítor Gaspar, I'll ask for your understanding, because we have one or two very quick questions, and then we go for a last intervention from each one of the speakers.
So the European Union has been working on the possibility of issuing a digital euro. Do you consider this project as being able to increase economic and political stability in the Union?
I have another question. What is the outlook of further developments in relation to economic and fiscal union? And do you think that the Ukraine crisis could affect that calendar?
Okay, there's another one, and this one is the last, because they're already making signs.
That one.
Yeah, he was raising his hand. I saw it. Okay, so.
First of all, thank you very much for being here.
So, okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for being here. My question is more related to Portugal specifically. We know that we have since 20 years real growth rates of the economy close to zero. We have many reforms to do, and we don't see these reforms being done. And my question is, what do you see for Portugal in the next years? In terms of, because the debt will become more costly with inflation going up, rates will go up, and the central bank will have to raise interest rates. So my question is just this: as Portugal has not a very strong fiscal capacity at the moment, do you think that we are heading in the right direction, this government? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this will be the very last question before we start hearing from Vítor.
First and foremost, thank you to Mr. Reigling for being here. It's not every day that we have the honor to have a member of a European institution with us at our faculty. And my question is it's less maybe a technically oriented question, because I think that many times we are stuck in discussing technicalities of how to better integrate Europe, and how maybe the fiscal union is a necessity to complement our monetary union. But my question is specifically to Mr. Reigling, and it has to do with an issue that I struggle with, which is if Mr. Reigling identifies himself first and foremost as a European and then as a German, or first and foremost as German and then European.
Thank you, and we'll hear from Mr. Reigling, but following the order, I'll give the word to Vítor now. Lots of questions for you to answer.
Thank you. I'll try to be selected. Just on the very first question about fiscal sustainability and price stability in the exit strategy, I think that the best example that we have in the world, the clearest example, is the US. In the US, the fiscal response was unprecedented, so much so that George Hall and Tom Sargent basically compare the response to COVID-19 not with the fiscal response to the global financial crisis or even the Great Depression, but with World War I and World War II. And what we have seen in the United States is that the recession was very profound, very sudden, but very short-lived. Basically, we're talking about March and April 2020. At this point in time, the Fed is already in its path towards monetary policy normalization. And as I remarked right at the beginning, the public debt to GDP path that we have now is very similar to the one that was projected pre-COVID-19. That is, the United States does have to face some challenges having to do with long-term debt sustainability, but the shock associated with the pandemic itself has been to a large extent, not complete, but to a very large extent absorbed. As the concern with deflation and recession has eased, the monetary policy in the US is no longer constrained by the effective lower bound, and therefore, in the normal assignment between monetary and fiscal policy, monetary focuses on delivering price stability, while fiscal concentrates on allocational issues like long-run growth. Just think about the green transition and the technological transition, and distributional effects associated with the fight against poverty and making sure that all have access to basic public services like education and health. When it comes to Europe, the second question of this group, the relation between fiscal union and the current macroeconomic developments is not very close. On the contrary, as the ECB pivots towards inflation fighting, we go much closer to the type of world that was envisaged in Maastricht, that is one in which monetary policy delivers price stability and fiscal policy aims at stability. Now, please bear in mind that being the issuer of a safe asset is a precious capacity to have that allows the government to act forcefully in the case of a crisis. Fiscal sustainability is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to be an issuer of a safe asset. A number of other institutional conditions are necessary, and Cristina Casalinho could specify those in much more detail. But please bear in mind that a resilient regime should be designed to function under a diversity of circumstances. And from that viewpoint, one needs to have a system of institutions that work well when the problem is inflation, but also work well when there are dangers, for example, of declining prices or financial instability. The resilience regime should respond adequately to the conceivable shocks to the economy, or even to disturbances that we cannot imagine right now. If you allow me telegraphically one last message, in the spring meetings, the International Monetary Fund basically said that the most important source of downward revision to economic prospects in the world and in Europe was war, war in Europe, war in Ukraine, and that the best that can happen is for the war to stop. And again, that is very important for the world. It is of crucial importance for Europe, and it makes sense to highlight the importance of peace in Europe in the day that celebrates the Schumann Declaration. And I stop here.
Thank you, and I think that's a closing statement we can all agree with. Christina, do you want to add something?
Well, just to reiterate what Peter Gaspar just mentioned, that resilient regimes are the ones that allow us to weather off all possible shocks, and mostly the ones that are not anticipated or not definitely unforeseen. One word on something that was questioned about digital euro. This is my personal view. I really think that we'll have to have some sort of digital euro. Actually, we will already have some sort of, at least one of the functions that the digital euro is supposed to perform is already performed, given the fact that we have a centralized payment system that is being made available by the European Central Bank. So if you ask for instant transfers, this is something that already exists, at least in terms of wholesale. So the digital euro, in terms of retail, is something a little bit more complex. And sometimes when we mentioned the digital euro, I'm not sure that we know or understand in full its consequences, namely in terms of how the will fund the economy. So what sort of role will the banking sector perform, and who will perform a significant function that is to assess the credit risk of the firms and households when they apply for credit. Thank you.
Thank you. Joanna, for a closing statement?
Just agreeing with everything that was said, and this diversity of circumstances we are really now facing with Ukraine. The plan of resilience and recovery was thought before Ukrainian war. This has, like Victor said, many consequences at many levels that might have implications for how we design and see that recovery. It's really an uncertain time, but where we need to make commitments to the long run, so it's difficult. But I think above all, in this problem of low long-term growth, the way you use this opportunity will be defining, not just for the next 2 years, but for the next 20 and 30 years. So it's on us.
Yes, I can continue exactly there. There was a question whether the war in Ukraine might accelerate European integration, and I think it will. Like the pandemic led to new tools that were created, which had been unthinkable before. The euro crisis 12 years ago led to the ESM, something that was not anticipated the previous decade. So, as Schumann told us, during crisis these things happen. Would be better not to have the crisis and still develop, but given that's not the experience. So I think Ukraine can again trigger something, not necessarily for the monetary union, but for instance, a common defense budget would be a logical outcome. And that takes me to the last question, whether I feel more like a European or a German. I'm a convinced European for a number of reasons. I've been working on these issues for 40 years. But importantly, I also lived 10 years outside Europe, in the US and in Asia. And I could really see that our European economic and social model, with all its problems, it's better than what I find in the rest of the world. That's already a reason to work more on this. In addition, the last decade we have seen that there are really two superpowers, the US and China, who are not fighting at a war, but they are in conflict. there are trade wars, there were trade conflicts before the Ukraine, with the Ukraine. This may all intensify. China is moving in a different direction than I thought 10 years ago. So there are these two superpowers. Europe has to watch out that we are not squeezed between these two. And the only answer for me is to work more together, integrate more, strengthen the role of the euro as an international currency. That's our best way to survive between these two superpowers. And then it doesn't matter whether you are Portuguese or German or French or Spanish. I think we have to act together as Europeans.
Thank you very much for that, and I think I would like to thank you all. I think we started with banking union and central fiscal capacity. We went through inflation and debt, and now we ended with the role of Europe in the world and has a potency in the world. So I'd like to thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting debate, and I wanted to especially thank our audience and the questions. They were very interesting and made this debate very lively. Thank you very much. Muito obrigada a todos.
Excuse me. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you all here discussing the challenge that the European Union is facing. We know that the debate is essential when we are trying to improve something, and this discussion, this debate was a very pleasant way to celebrate Europe's Day. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Volto agora ao português também para agradecer todo o apoio da Universidade Católica na organização deste evento. Agradecer a todos também os que participaram, porque é com muito gosto que vejo uma sala cheia com tanta juventude interessada nesta área. E para fazermos o encerramento em beleza, eu pedia, por favor, ao professor Filipe Santos, Dean da Católica Lisbon School of Business and Economics, que fechasse esta conferência. Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigado, Diana. And for our guests here, I will shift to English again. It is a privilege for Católica Lisbon to co-organize and host this conference on the European economy, especially today, Europe Day. If there were doubts in the minds of any about the importance of the European Union, I think the events of the last few years and months made very clear to all of us that in what regards Europe, united we stand, divided we fall. I think we realize now how fragile and wonderful is the peace and prosperity we achieved in the last 70 years, and how important it's to keep it and to work towards a more integrated and articulated Europe with the right values, mechanisms, institutions, and policies. But I also wanted to make a point about the scale of the economic challenge ahead of us. Lately, especially in Portugal, we have discussed a lot about recovery and resilience. And that's the wording, the title of our plan. But language matters. And these words can fool us in thinking that the economic challenges is easier than it is. Recovering is getting back to where we were. Resilience is avoiding crisis. In reality, I would argue that we are in a dramatic moment in economic history. We currently have 7 specters haunting our economy, some of which were addressed today. Climate change that can have catastrophic consequences for life on our planet. High public debts and their sustainability, especially in Southern Europe, but here including France and Belgium. Rise of political extremism in both left and right, war in Europe, more recently, now in Ukraine, we don't know tomorrow, deglobalization and the rising protectionism in the blocks that were just mentioned, inflation, not only in prices, but I would also argue in assets like stocks, bonds, and crypto assets that we have discussed lately, and maybe a challenge that we have not discussed a lot, but I think it's very fundamental, the aging of the population that will have huge economic consequences that need to be managed. So what we need is not only recovery and resilience, but transformation. That involves reconfiguration of value chains, an energy transition on steroids, enabling the digital disruption that is affecting industries and using it as to speed the transformation process, and also a massive reskilling of workers and education for the new generation. So my point, what I wanted to bring with naming these specters, is that never before, I would argue, was effective and sound economic policy more important to allow us to address these challenges. So we need, at both European, national, but also industry level, policies that will empower companies and entrepreneurs who are ultimately the agents of economic growth. We need policies that promote inclusive and sustainable development in our economy and society. And we need policies that wisely navigate the short-term risks while still addressing the long-term challenges. So that is the scope of the challenge. And so I say to our students here, never before was learning insightful, deep economic policy more important than ever to address our future challenges. At Católica Lisbon, as a hub for economics, research and learning, we want to contribute to address these challenges. We do so in different ways. We have NESEP, our Católica Lisbon Forecasting Lab, which is one of the world's best economic forecasters for the Portuguese economy. And in the last 2 years, under Professor Joana Silva, we have Prosper, our Center of Economics for Prosperity, that is developing the insights and analysis for public policies that really promote prosperity and development. And from just an idea, created a team of about 20 people now with the students, faculty, postdocs, researchers addressing these challenges. And of course, we have our talented economics faculty, students, and alumni like Vítor Gaspar and Cristina Casalinho, who are here today, forming a knowledge community to nurture the economics insight and talent that we need to address our future challenges. So that was the message that I wanted to share with you today. It's challenging, but with insights, with knowledge, with wisdom, we'll be able at different levels to overcome our challenges. As I close, I think some thank yous are in order. So first, thank you to our partner and co-organizer, Jornal de Negócios, and to Diana Ramos for moderating also the conference. Thank you to Klaus Regling and to all our panel speakers and moderator. Thank you. Usually when initiatives develop, they usually have a champion, and the champion for this organization was Professor Joana Silva. So thank you for the inspiration with Negócios to develop this event, this conference. And also thank you to our institutional marketing team with Daniela Gomes for organizing all of the elements. As I mentioned, we really are keen to develop the economics talent and insight of our community and of our students, which will be the leader economists of the next generation. So we have also created a competition, a student competition based on the discussions of today's conference. We asked our students to, based on their knowledge and the learnings from today, to answer the question, how to move towards a more sustainable and resilient European economy. Prosper will receive submissions from the students with their insights and ideas, both either video or statements, and we will select a winner, award a prize, and share that with our panelists and guests. Now, to close the conference, to continue our discussions, I would like to invite you to a cocktail that will happen in the back, so you can leave from this door to the left or from the back, and we'll continue our conversations about how to build a more resilient and recovery and also transformative economy. Thank you very much. All the best.